Welcome, everybody. Thrilled to have you all back. This is a exciting conclusion to our series. So I'm excited to introduce our guest in just a moment, but just a couple of minutes of housekeeping before we start. For those who have not attended any others, you're going to want to hear the first 15 minutes, 20 minutes where we go into the data. If you have heard this story before, you've listened to any of the previous webinars in the series, then you could probably skip through the first 15 minutes, 20 minutes of me doing the data download and just get the benefit of Rich Diviney. But a couple of little housekeeping notes. So first, um, if you haven't joined any of the other sessions, I would recommend you learning from some of our other colleagues. Lamar Pierce and Fran Lawler were our first webinar. They talked a lot about change management and leadership and this idea of leadership energy and what's required right now. Um, we followed that one with Lisa Leahy and Amy Fox, which we got deeply into trauma and psychology and cognition and all of the work that Amy's done in her client work with Mobius and Lisa Leahy with all of her research on immunity to change and everyone culture. And then we just had an incredible session last week with Ben Putterman and Josh Burson, really looking at HR systems and organizations. And again, about leadership, which we're going to talk about today as a thread. But these three are all looking at the system of organizations, our human systems. What we're going to do with Rich today is probably focus more on pragmatic tools. As a close to the series, trying to be as helpful as we can be, really want to offer you all as much of a tool set as we can offer as we get into this evolution in the workforce, these changing expectations of what we're seeing with this radical movement as we give birth to the species of AI and put them into our organizations. So with that, let me just invite Rich Diviney up and ask him to join. Rich, so good to see you, sir.
You as well, Gordon. Thanks for having me.
I'm psyched for the conversation. So thank you for taking your time. And I know you're busy promoting your new book and other things that you're up to. But let me just ask as we start before I do the data. I've asked this from the other guests as well. Um, why is this moment meaningful to you? I mean, when you deal with the missions of the SEALs versus the evolving world of the workforce,
Yeah.
how are these things correlated, and why are you excited to bring your tools to leaders and organizations right now?
Well, I think so. First of all, it's great to see you. Thanks for having me. I always look for excuses for us to talk and chat. So this is just another one of those, which is great. But
Pleasure.
uh, you know, um, if there's one certainty in life, it's that uncertainty will show up. And what we have to, whether you're a Navy SEAL, whether you're a business person, whether you're a parent, whether you're a student, whatever you are, uncertainty is always going to show up. And I think the reason why what I do and why it matters is that the more we can be ready for action in uncertainty, the better off we're going to do. And by ready for action, it doesn't necessarily mean everything has to be perfect. It just means what can I do I know what I have to do in this moment? Now, that's coupled with the fact that we're on this precipice of, if not maybe even over the cliff of AI, and really what we can see is a radical change in what's going to be going on. I mean, just like the computer changed our lives in the 80s, we couldn't even imagine in the 80s what computers would be doing 30 years from that position. We can't imagine where AI is going to take us. So the uncertainty in our environment is stark, and by stark, it doesn't mean positive nor negative. It just means it's there. And so thinking about how we're going to navigate and maneuver in this new environment is of great importance. And I will also add that, and I know we're going to get into this, I am really big on the fact that the qualities we bring into an environment matter. It's more than just the skills, what we know how to do. It's who we are as a human and what are those qualities we're bringing into an environment. And with AI kind of starting to take over a lot of the skills-based tasks, our performance is going to be measured by the qualities we're bringing in versus the skills we have. And so that's where I really come into the mix, because that's the whole attributes concept, is what are the qualities and how do each one of us distinguish our own unique performance in that way. And yeah, I think it's going to be an exciting conversation, and I think it's certainly apropos.
Yeah. Well, and I want to spend a lot of time thinking about this relationship between skills and attributes because a lot of what we're seeing in corporations is this demand for reskilling. Like we're hear this term all the time. Like we could lose a third of our staff. That's an option. But we could reskill them as well. And this idea that we're building the super workers, and what is this rise of the super worker? But if we're going to build these new skills, if we are going to invest and not lose these folks, then what are the attributes that need to be present that allow for that reskilling to happen effectively? And that's what topic that we've been wrestling with on the other seminars.
Yeah, 100%. You're 100% correct because we can't, yeah, uncertainty is by definition, you cannot prepare for it. So you just don't know what you're going to need in those moments, which means we don't know what skills are going to be required in those moments, but we can understand the attributes we're bringing to it so that we can then effectively maneuver and perform.
Well, let's dive in. I'd love to spend about 15, 20 minutes walking through the data and for you to just take some notes and to think about your interpretations of what we're seeing here. And then we'll spend the rest of our time, about 30 minutes, talk about the implications of what to do about it.
Awesome.
So with that, I'm going to share my screen. It's about 6 minutes past, and I will watch the time and crank through this the best I can. So as we dive into this data, I want to start with what were we seeking to do? And different than other studies, and we've seen a lot of the other workforce studies over the last year, and many of them focused on AI. This one wasn't centered on AI. It just ended up becoming a centerpiece based on the narratives from participants. What we focused on is unrealized potential. That was really the main area that we wanted to understand is how much of our skills, our attributes, our passions, our creativity is sitting on the sidelines. And I shared this in the previous seminar with Ben Putterman because he and I have been talking about this for about 20 years, 15, 20 years. We saw that the expectations of the workforce was changing and the rise of the freelance or the free agents were coming in the early 2000s. And we knew that the contract between an employee and employer was dramatically shifting. And what would that mean in terms of how much people brought versus held back and how loyal were people, how committed were people? These were all the questions that here we are after COVID, after all the changes that we've seen in the last half a decade, in hybrid work, in social change, in politics. Like, how does this really impact this human potential? So we had our AI interview over 700 people in the study. We're over 900 now, but when we pulled for this study and this data set, it was about 728 here. And these were AI interviews, took place about 15, 20 minutes long. And the AI asked a set of questions, which you'll see in a moment, and was able to analyze all of that data as well, along with some really smart scientists and advisors like the folks that you've seen on our webinars. And finally, having this global discussion. So this has been our ambition, is to not only do this analysis, but really to have discussions on the implications and what we do about it. We had three primary areas of inquiry, talking about this shifting of expectations. What does it mean for managers and leaders to want or need something different than employees need, and how have these shifts impacted the workforce over the last decade or so? We're wondering also about how these changes and the uncertainty in front of us, especially with AI, and Rich was speaking to some of this right now. The only thing we know is the uncertainty ahead. How is that impacting people's stress levels, their cognition, their emotion, their psychology? So we knew that that was highly impacted. We wanted to understand more about it. And then finally, how do we unlock this potential? What is going to be the path forward for leaders? What do we invest in? What are the interventions? How do we think about that? On the right-hand side, those are the questions that we asked. What are people's beliefs about these changing expectations? We asked for some quant scores around the embodiment that people are experiencing, and also how they'd score their organizations on their capacity, their readiness to harness potential from their employees. We spoke to AI, we spoke to programs that are effective and less effective today, and asked for ideas for improvement and advice for leaders. I'm going to show you this data in just a moment. In terms of expectations, we'll show them in polarities. In terms of the emotion and cognition, those issues we're going to show in terms of personas. How do these people show up and who are they? And the archetypes of personas, I think, were a very helpful way to think about that. And then finally, What is the unrealized potential and how do we unlock that? What are the barriers and what are the solutions? So, doing narrative analytics, getting a large scale quant and qual study, you're going to see a lot of the qual show up in themes like this. So this is about frequency. These are the words that were spoken the most. When we put this through a filter of sentiment analysis, we looked at the emotions and the context that surrounded their statements. And this is where AI is really effective at understanding not just what people are saying, but why they're saying it. Our AI does ask probing questions, so we get secondary and tertiary probes into their comments so we can really get this sense of emotion. And when you look at these words again that were most frequent, but through the filters of emotion, you see that there's a high degree of stress and overwhelm and fear related to a lot of these ideas. So that really started us off on the research to at least seek to understand what was this anxiety and what was this fear all about. So we looked at this emotional spectrum. Where were people across the spectrum? There's a group of people, about 12%, that are articulating their state as fearful and anxious. And those are the ones that are willing to say that. 36% are more uncertain. You're going to see a range of emotions in their language. You'll also see some of those negative emotions in some of the other archetypes as well. When people are saying they're positive or pragmatic and enthusiastic, we're also seeing fear and anxiety in their language. So it's dominant in terms of pragmatism and enthusiasm with about 52%. But we have almost half of our organizations today just digging in their heels or threatened or fearful. So they're certainly not bringing their best. When we're asking them what percentage of their energy, their potential is being realized, they're saying there's about a third that's still on the table. When we ask them, why is that? Or some underlying feelings around that, explain it. People are saying things like, I have so many creative ideas, but there's no time to support them. I'm hungry to learn and grow, but there's no path here. And we're going to talk about these polarities and why this is increasingly difficult. And Rich, as you look at this data, I'm curious on what this means in terms of hammering into people's psyche their fear and uncertainty when there is no time, when they aren't being recognized. So how well does their company convert their energy, their potential into value? Again, it's similar. It's about 1/3 left on the table, or 2/3 of their capacity is being realized. And what are they saying? They're saying my company's doing a great job, but little, there's always a little more potential or a lot more potential, depending to unlock. There's so much more if we took the time to understand and leverage what we have. So, in terms of a company's capacity to convert energy and potential into value, why is that? And now we start getting into the polarities. Why is that stuck where it is? And when we were listening into perceptions from executives and leaders, and we separated them from employees, we found that there is some really significant distinctions in worldview and beliefs. And right now, in a state of stress and uncertainty, we're seeing that depending on where you are on the hierarchy, you're probably reacting to that stress differently. So, in high degrees of uncertainty and stress, if you're a leader, you're demanding what you see on the right hand side: more control, more productivity, more control of information, more status quo, more business needs. I explained this on other webinars. I've literally heard CEOs saying, I don't give a shit if people are engaged anymore. I don't care if they're happy. We need to get our work done. We need to talk about critical priorities. We're tired of coddling these employees. You probably heard similar things echoing in the hallways of your organizations. And when leaders are saying, I'm tired of coddling people, we need to get work done, you have to recognize where employees are on the left-hand side in their state of stress and anxiety and uncertainty. They need more control as well. They want more flexibility to deal with their life situations. They're asking for even more meaning and purpose, extended amounts of transparency and honesty, um, more opportunities for growth and development, especially in this world of AI, and for them to felt cared for in terms of their well-being. So when you look at this picture, and it's hard to actually place these on the spectra, but you can see that these are not issues that you can just message against. These are fundamental challenges on beliefs and worldview that are separate and growing more distinct, more separate over time, depending on the level of strain and stress in the environment. So we have a ton of data on this. I'm not showing a lot here, but for anybody who's watching, you can go to agency150.com and download the full report. So here's just some examples of where those positions are polarized. So as we get into their mindsets and you start seeing these different worldviews, let's talk about these personalities. So we asked our AI, Vega, to outline for us the data set that we have with these interviews as expressed in the world of personas. So when we look at who are the people who are saying these things, this set right here, these four personas represent about 85% to 90% of our audience. So most people fit into one of these four. And if you think about who you experience yourselves in your own workplace, they probably fall into one of these four categories. So as I lay out, if you can listen into who are these people and how can you relate to them? And the exam question here is, how do you help each one of these personas uniquely, depending on where they are? We can't evolve our organizations, or we can't reskill our organizations evenly. We can't think about this as a shotgun, one size fits all. We have to think about these unique personalities. And if there's fast followers that are looking for the early adopters, who are the early adopters? You might find them in the purpose-driven strivers here. But these are the questions that you should be asking yourselves as you think about these personas and how they relate to your work. So one by one, real quickly, the anxious builder. The anxious builder is somebody that today is excited about the potential and is just doing what they're told. They see the excitement. They want to be a part of it. They are driving forward. They're doing what they're told in terms of building and evolving their tool sets, but they don't know what they're doing it for. And they do have a fear that they are building their own prisons or getting themselves out of a job. So you hear that in their language. What is their emotional state? They're excited, but they're also concerned. They're also overwhelmed. They need clear communications about the strategy. They need a supportive environment. They need an ethical guideline and structure to evolve. But they're doing what they're told. They want to grow, and they are on the queue, if not in the front of the line, for the reskilling in their organizations. They say things like, "I think it's decreasing motivation and ethics, but AI is great, and I'm a huge champion of it." So there's this real polarity even in their own statements, but they are closer to the cutting edge than some of the other personas, especially this one, the disengaged traditionalist. And somebody remarked on a previous webinar that these do not necessarily live in generations. We shouldn't think about these generationally, but this does skew to maybe a more senior worker. But it skews. It's not totally representative. So if you think about a disengaged traditionalists might mean that they've been around longer. They are skeptical of new technologies. They like the way that things used to be done. They might be putting on blinders right now, hoping that this thing is going to end. They feel apathy. They feel resentment. They feel some cynicism. They are motivated by security and stability, which is very difficult right now. So they're sort of driving forward and doing what they've always done. They need clear expectations. They need ongoing communications. They are going to be tough to become sort of front of the line as others might be. What are they saying? Local talent seems to have levels of expectation demands, and they put it as satisfactory at best. I retained EU staff recently with less experience. So these folks just want to do things the way that they've done before. It seems to me that not enough people now are focused on actual results. They think a lot of this stuff that is being done today with AI is ancillary, which is quite different than this next persona. This is the purpose-driven striver. They are looking for meaning in the work. I love the visual that our designer set up for this one. This one feels vivacious. They feel like they are on the cutting edge. They also, to go further, need more too. They need more meaning. They need more support. So when it says a purpose-driven striver, it doesn't mean that they necessarily have purpose. They're seeking purpose, and purpose drives them. So they're driven, they're motivated, they're engaged. They want flexibility, they want growth, they seek potential. They need opportunities for growth. They need more communications. They seek balance. They say things like, I want to do more work for myself with more autonomy. They want to be challenged. They want more purpose and meaning. So these are things that they're asking for, but they're, again, a little bit more out in front. The last persona we call the overworked pragmatist. They know how to get the job done. I think he's quite representative in his visual as well. They're overworked and underappreciated. They're struggling to get the increased demands in the fast-paced environment just to finish the day's job, let alone evolve into a new world. They're stressed, they're anxious, they're frustrated, they have too much to do. So what do they need to get more done? They need stuff out of the way. They need to clear the path. They need to feel like this is being laid out to them in a fair and equitable way. But truly, they just need the engagement and they need barriers removed because they're feeling exhausted. So you look at all of these folks and you put them across these emotional spectra, and you see that some feel more disconnected, the disengaged traditionalist and the overworked pragmatist. Some feel more present, like the builders and the strivers. But if you look left to right, who's feeling most expanded and present? That's the purpose-driven striver. So if you think about each of these, the dormant potential that lives in the anxious builder, the curiosity that lives inside of the pragmatist, the contraction and uncertainty that can be opened up if we can unfreeze the culture and give the disengaged traditionalists reasons to believe and move forward and make it easy for them as well. So again, each one of these folks needs something a little different, and this is the totality of what they need if we summarize. So when we asked Vega to simplify the path forward, and we have a lot of different solutions that have been asked for by the participants, and I have great quotes in the broader study. But if we distill this down, it's really these core pillars. Number one, it's reinvesting or investing in reskilling and development. We've been talking about investing in development for a long time. I was a chief learning officer. I have many folks that are in the L&D world. This is not a new message, but I think this is a message that has more urgency than ever. And as Rich is going to get into, how do we actually reskill in the state that we're in right now, which starts moving over to the other columns. What do they need to do reskilling? How do they get to a solid ground so that their amygdala isn't hijacking their brain and their prefrontal cortex is online and they can actually think and learn and grow? They need more empathy, more transparency. They need to hear their feedback that was listened to and applied. They want their concerns addressed. They want to be part of the future of the organization. They want to know what that future is and see themselves in it, which takes us over to the third column, which is about meaning and purpose. And again, not a new message, but maybe one that's more urgent than it's been in the past. So we need to find more opportunities to give people, really, if you look at all three, the conditions, the environment. This is why we had Lisa Leahy on, for learning, for developmental activity, for people to feel like they're a part of something, for the change immunity to go down and for our motivation to go up. So these are really setting the conditions forward. There's some specific feedback here for you, but I'm going to stop the share and bring Rich on, and happy to navigate through the deck again, Rich, but to take it out of the broad strokes and into the detail. And before we do that, just as you hear all of this, and you've read some of the detail in the study before, but as you hear all of it this morning, like what hits you as you hear all of that? What's the first instinct that you have about where we are as a workforce, as a humanity?
Well, I think the first instinct or what hits me is that we're all dealing with uncertainty in our own unique ways. I mean, every one of those four profiles has their own unique set of challenges and set of things that are causing them anxiety and uncertainty, and in some cases fear. Even the purpose-driven striver, to some extent, even though kind of top right on your chart is feeling a little bit lost. And so the question is, how do we kind of capture that for everybody in a way that they can effectively implement some solutions wherever they sit. And the good news is we can totally do that because we're all human. We all have the same neurology and physiology, which means we can apply some very specific tools to whatever position we're in here, albeit maybe look at it from a couple different angles. But yeah, what I see is in most cases, as I see everywhere, there's uncertainty, there's anxiety, and there's fear, and there's things we can do to stave that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about their character first, because this is what you and I have been talking about for several years. I was blown away by your book Attributes. I brought you into my previous organization. I was really excited to see the impact that you were making on our senior people. So I know the power of focusing on attributes. And as we think about the reskilling here that's required, as I teed up earlier, like there still needs to be some focus on our character. So when you think about the attributes that you've studied of high performance teams and of your elite performers in the SEALs, what are the attributes that you see as most important to focus on that we think about as a workforce today?
Yeah, well, that's a very difficult question because it's very subjective. And you know, I just so we can level the, I guess, so we can level the bubble for the audience. Let's just talk about the difference between the two. There's a difference between skills and attributes, and this is something that I had to discover when I was put in charge of selection and assessment for SEAL Team 6, which is one of our most elite units. But we weren't, when we were putting guys through this process, we weren't able to effectively articulate why certain guys weren't making it through. We'd say something like, "Well, the guy couldn't shoot very well." But you put a Navy SEAL of that caliber, you tell that guy he can't shoot very well. That's a person who's probably shot more rounds than most people in the military. So it becomes disingenuous to them and to us, and the leadership starts to ask tough questions. So what I recognize is that we were actually not looking specifically for or at skills. There was something different there. There we were looking for qualities, and this hit me in a couple ways. First of all, you know, it was 2010 when I was doing this work, and I had been through Navy SEAL training, BUDS, in mid 90s, and anybody who knows anything about BUDS, it's a very difficult selection course. There's 90% attrition rate, so 90% of the guys who start don't make it through. But all this to say, when you go through BUDS, you spend hundreds of hours running around with big heavy boats on your head and hundreds of hours exercising with 300-pound telephone poles. Now, by 2010, when I was doing this work, I'd already been on hundreds of combat missions in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And I can tell you with certainty that never on one of them did I carry a big heavy boat on my head or a 300-pound telephone pole. So what I recognize is what they were doing to us in those moments weren't training us. They weren't training us in the skills to be Navy SEALs. They were actually teasing out these qualities to see if we had what it took to be Navy SEALs, if we had the attributes. So that was one way, and then the other way it hit me was I was talking to a friend of mine. He was an older SEAL. He'd been an instructor even years before I'd gone through. But he said, you know, Rich, there's a story about a kid who showed up to Navy SEAL training one day, and he walked into the instructor's offices and said, "I want to be a Navy SEAL." And the instructor said, "Okay, but you have to do a swim test." And the kid said, "Okay, fine." So they took him out to the pool. It was an easy test, 50 meters, so 25 meters to one end, 25 meters back to the other end. Anyway, this kid gets all ready to go and proceeds to jump into the pool and then proceeds to sink to the bottom of the pool. And at the bottom of the pool, he starts walking across the bottom of the pool to one end. He touches one end and he walks across the bottom of the pool back to the other end. And he comes up and he's gasping for air, nearly drowning. And the instructor looks at him and says, "What the heck are you doing?" And the kid, who's still trying to catch his breath, looks at the instructor and says, "I'm sorry, instructor, I don't know how to swim." At that point, the instructor pauses and he looks at the kid and says, "That's okay, we can teach you how to swim." Now, the question is, why did the instructor say that? He said that because he knew if this kid had the qualities, the attributes to show up to Navy SEAL training and he didn't know how to swim, he had everything inside of him that we needed for him to be a Navy SEAL. Teaching him the skill of swimming was going to be the easy part. And so what I understood there is we had to bifurcate the terms. Skills and attributes are two different things. They're not inherent to our nature. In other words, we're not born with the ability to ride a bike or throw a ball. They direct our behavior and known in specific environments. And then they're very easy because they're very visible. They're very easy to assess, measure, and test. You can put scores around them. You can put statistics around them. You can put them on resumes, which is why we get seduced by them. What skills don't tell us is how we're going to show up in stress, challenge, and uncertainty, because in an unknown environment, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to apply a known skill. This is when we lean on attributes. Attributes, on the other hand, are inherent to our nature. In other words, all of us are born with levels of adaptability and patience and situation awareness. You can certainly develop attributes over time and experience, yes, but you can see levels of this stuff in very small children. Attributes don't direct our behavior, they inform our behavior. They tell us how we're going to show up to an environment. So, my son's levels of perseverance and resilience, for example, informed the way he showed up when he was learning the skill of riding a bike. And he was falling off a dozen times doing so. And then finally, because they're difficult to see, they're very difficult to measure and assess. How do you measure someone's levels of adaptability or patience? The idea, though, is they show up the most visibly and viscerally during times of stress, challenge, and uncertainty. And so if we're missing out on attributes in our performance picture, we're missing out on the most important part of how and why we perform the way we do. But like we said at the outset of this webinar, AI is out there. AI is starting to take away skills. AI is starting to do the things, the skills that we previously were doing. And so what we have to start to do is start to say, okay, what are the qualities that we bring to the table to allow us to, in fact, deal and play successfully in this new world? And so attributes become very, very important. And when we talk about the attributes for each person or for each team, that's a very unique, subjective thing. The attributes required to be a great Navy SEAL team look different than the attributes required to be a great sales team or teachers team or surgical team. But we all know, we should know as individuals, we all come to the table with all of these attributes. We just each have different levels of the attributes. So if we take adaptability, which on our assessment tool, 7 is high, 1 is low. I'm about a 6 on adaptability, which means when the environment changes around me outside of my control, it's fairly easy for me to go with the flow and roll with it. Someone else might be a level 3 on adaptability. Same thing happens to them. It's difficult for them to go with the flow. Now they're still adaptable because all human beings are. It's just there's more friction there. So if we were to kind of line up these attributes on a wall like dimmer switches, all of us would have different dimmer switch settings, and that starts to speak to our own unique performance fingerprint or profile. That becomes enormously important in not only how we perform individually, but also how we mesh as teams and perform as teams. And so, just to kind of level it, we attributes are extremely important in this new environment, these qualities. And this is what we're finding in most businesses. They're realizing, oh, wait a second, we've been looking at it wrong. We've been doing what SEAL Team 6 was doing. We've been trying to judge on skills. And you're not going to get the right answer. And oh, by the way, a lot of times what's going to happen is you're gonna pick the person who's like the rock star on paper, and then they're gonna get into that team, and suddenly they're toxic, and they're the wrong team member. They're not a good fit because we've picked on the wrong criteria. We have to look at the attributes first.
So with that background and setup, what if I can go back to the attributes most critical at this moment? And I know it's difficult to say, but when we think about whether you're an individual contributor, manager, or leader, what should you be focused on? What could you be harnessing more? What should you be thinking about in terms of your own character? Not, I don't want to push to the point of like, who should you be hiring for?
Yeah,
That's
yeah, 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 yeah.
that's that's next. But just in terms of our own self-work.
Well, the first thing we should endeavor to do is explore where we fall on these attributes. In other words, what are we high on, what are we low on? And
Mhm.
also approach it with no judgment, because when you look at your attribute profile, for example, your top 5 and your bottom 5 don't equal your strengths and your weaknesses. In other words, your success as a human being is as much because of your bottom 5 as your top 5. If you're low on patience, well, your low patience has helped you in many and different endeavors, right? So but to understand where we fall starts to give us and each of us a unique picture of how and why we perform the way we do. And so that's really of utmost importance, because if I'm low on adaptability, for example, just by knowing that, I now know what I have to lean into when the environment's changing around me. If I'm high on discipline, now I know, hey, I know I'm someone who actually looks at a goal or a task or a project and can organize it very rapidly and stick to what I need to do. There's advantages to self-knowledge. I think one of the things I've recognized about all high performers, all top performers, is there's always a very, very um, uh, dedicated analysis onto one's own performance, an introspective exercise constantly. Hey, how and why do I perform the way we do? And it's done with humility, in the sense that I'm just as aware and transparent about my strengths as I am about my weaknesses. And I think that's the strength of understanding these about ourselves and understanding where we fall. So
Yeah.
that's number one. I
Well,
think
you
when it
speak
comes
to
to
humility.
yeah,
Keep going.
yeah. No, I think when it comes to teaming, then what we have
Mhm.
to understand is when it comes to teaming is that we have to be transparent with each other as teammates and understand how and what we're bringing to the team. When we talk about humility, for example, in the SEAL teams or any high performing teams, I would say humility is not about just showing our weaknesses. It's not about this deference, which is oftentimes the default. It's about being as transparent about your strengths as you are about your weaknesses. I'm wearing everything on my sleeve because my teammate needs to
Mhm.
know what I'm strong at and what I'm weak at, so we know when we can actually mesh together and set up. And these attributes start to matter because on many teams, polarities actually strengthen the team. Gordon, you know my wife very well. We're all friends, so you know her. You know her her attributes to a certain degree. She is a low patience person. Okay. I am a high patience person. Now, we've been married for 24 years, lived a war together, have raised two young men through all of that. And that's worked beautifully for us in that relationship because when patience has been required, I step up. When impatience is required, she steps up. Her
Mhm.
impatience has often prevented me from taking too long on doing something or procrastinating. My patience has sometimes prevented her from moving too fast on something or making a decision too quickly. So when you by understanding these as a team, you start to mesh together like a zipper, and it becomes really, really very powerful and effective in teaming in any capacity.
So you speak about humility a couple times here. In our research, when we asked Vega about the most important attributes for this workforce moving forward, the phrases or the concepts of humility, curiosity, and vulnerability
Hmm.
are very central. And then there's a lot of that centered on this idea of regulating yourself. So self-regulation and humility and curiosity and vulnerability, how do they relate in your mind, and how do those attributes sit uh within the other set
Yeah,
to allow
yeah.
for other things to happen effectively?
Well, I think that it's a very apropos list, and I would agree with the lists. I mean, humility again, it's this ability to be as transparent about your strengths as you are about your weaknesses, and again, the key is transparent about it. I know that I have an understanding of my strengths and weaknesses. I think vulnerability is the expressive piece of that. In other words, humility is I understand it, and then vulnerability is I can express it, right? I can show it to other people. So I think both are important especially in teaming. Curiosity is an interesting one. I think curiosity, I would actually add open-mindedness to that. And the reason is because curiosity and open-mindedness are two distinct attributes that we talk about because there's differences. People conflate the two, but there is actually differences. Open-mindedness is defined as this ability to be passively open to new ideas, perspectives, and experiences. Okay, but the key word there is passive. Curiosity
Mhm.
adds a proactivity to that whole endeavor. So the example would be you and I go to a foreign country we've never been before, and we meet up with a local friend, and the local friend says, "Hey, I'm going to take you to the most authentic restaurant," and we're like, "Cool, let's do it." That's open-mindedness. Or you and I go to that country, we meet up with our local friend, we say, "Take us to the most authentic restaurant." That's curiosity. Why does this matter? Is because these things can live independently of each other. Someone can be high open-mindedness and low curiosity. That's not a bad thing. That's someone who's going to be generally amicable to new ideas, perspectives, and experiences. You're just not going to go find them seeking them out. Okay. You can also have someone who's really high on curiosity but low on open-mindedness. Well, this in its extremes is your conspiracy theorist. This is someone who knows exactly what they believe and are going to be curious to proving themselves right, but closed-minded to any other opportunities or ideas. So I think both curiosity and open-mindedness are important. I think if we were to default to either one, I'd say at least default to open-mindedness because open-mindedness helps in these environments. But curiosity is really very good because if there's a proactivity to it that gets ahead of it. So I would say your purpose-driven striver is probably curious, where your anxious builder might just be open-minded. And there's no problem with that, right? But just understand how those things bifurcate.
That makes a lot of sense. That
Yeah,
makes a lot of sense. Um, I also mentioned the phrase self-regulation in there. So let's
yeah,
talk about that a little bit because that's been a real theme in the other sessions. Like if you look at this data just in broad strokes, the first thing that you're going to notice is that we have a very anxious population. And then you start reading more research out there. The anxious generation, the age of outrage. I mean, there's a lot of material that's surfacing that whether it's our dopamine addiction with our phones, whether it's the stress that we're dealing with COVID and all the hybrid work and the change in politics and so forth. But um, self-regulation is harder and harder than it's been. Yes. And so what have you experienced around this need for self-regulation? How people are effectively doing that? What can we learn from SEALs in terms of the workforce? Help us on this topic.
yeah, sure. So I think when it comes to anxiety, I think anxiety is a very interesting term. And oh, by the way, I think a lot of what people are feeling, what really holds us back in many cases is fear. Okay. But
Mhm.
fear is actually quite specific in terms of how fear shows up on our system. This is when the amygdala starts to get tickled, our autonomic arousal is going up. But you know, and you know, I've done work now for several years. When I first got out of the Navy, I met Andrew Huberman, who's a neuroscientist out of Stanford, has a great podcast now. We were doing work together before the podcast when he was still running his Fear Lab, and we were kind of meshing this stuff together. One of the things we discovered and hypothesized was that fear is in fact a combination of two very distinct factors. And the combination of the combination is uncertainty plus anxiety equal fear. Okay. Now that means you can have one or the other. You don't necessarily have fear. So in other words, you can be anxious but not uncertain. Okay. That could be I have a presentation to give next week. I know the presentation. I know the people I'm giving it to. I'm a little anxious about it, but I'm not uncertain. There's no fear there. You can be
Yep.
uncertain without being anxious. Well, that's every kid on Christmas Eve. We know there's no fear there.
Right.
Okay. It's when you combine the two that fear starts to show up. And this is when we have to get concerned because this is what starts to stop people or get people really affected, both physiologically and neurologically, in terms of their ability to perform. So, all this to say is we can actually buy down our fear by buying down one or both of those factors, buying down uncertainty or buying down anxiety or buying down both. Okay. Let's start with anxiety. And one of the ways we can start to think about buying down anxiety, I know we've already had some conversations about this. Um, and so we'll talk about the physiological effects of anxiety. But anxiety, we have to start reframing, okay? Because anxiety is quite literally fiction. Anxiety is always future, it's always ahead of us, it's always something we are predicting that has not happened yet. Just like the past is history, the future is always fiction. Now, the effects of anxiety create stress. That's all very real. Stress is in the now. The physiological effects of stress are now. They're very real. But anxiety itself is fiction. It's projecting something that hasn't happened yet and getting physiologically affected by that. One of the things you'll never see Navy SEALs do is worry about stuff that they can't control in the moment. Okay. Now, that does not preclude proper planning. Right. We're always planning. And when we set a mission and when we have a mission, we say, okay, as we go through this mission, we might have this, this, and this happen. We'll plan for that. If this happens, we'll do this. But what we don't do is get paralyzed by analysis or paralyzed by things that we can't control in the moment. So we don't sit there worried about the future. We worry about the now. And so first, reframing anxiety to actually what it is helps with the ability to manage your anxiety. It's all fiction. It hasn't happened yet. It's not true. Now, all that to say, it also is, by the way, very energetically expensive. Okay. It takes a lot of our energy, both neurologically and physiologically, when we do that because we're creating stress in our system, all that cortisol. All right. So that's first thing, reframe it. Second thing is we've talked about, I know you've already been through this, there are physiological things you can do to bring down your anxiety. When we start or bring down our stress. When we are feeling that, our stress system is getting kicked in, our autonomic arousal is going up, amygdala is getting tickled. We know that our frontal lobe, decision-making, prefrontal cortex is starting to take a backseat to our limbic brain. Obviously, in the most extreme cases, we have amygdala hijack or autonomic overload. That's where our prefrontal cortex is now fully disengaged, and our limbic system, our lizard brain, is taken over. We are acting without thinking. Now that comes in very handy for jumping out of the way of a moving train or running from the bear. But in most cases, as we know and we've discussed, you want to have your prefrontal cortex engaged. So by bringing down your stress levels, bringing down your autonomic arousal, you can actually re-engage your frontal cortex and begin to make decisions. You, I know, have talked about this. There are visual tools, there are respiratory tools, and there are visual tools you can do this. Or you can start to use to do this, whether they be visual, open gaze, which is a really popular one and talk about in the book. This is just soft gaze. It's looking forward, not focusing on anything, just opening up your gaze to a soft gaze. So if you were to put your arms out, for example, you just notice what's in your peripheries. This has been proven to bring down our autonomic arousal. This, by the way, is why when you sit on a beach looking at a horizon, you feel calm, or at a landscape or a mountainscape, you feel calm. Because in stressful situations, our vision tends to tunnel in and focus in. So if we deliberately open it up, I used to do this, by the way, when I started public speaking. You can imagine as a Navy SEAL, you don't do a lot of public speaking. So I didn't like it, and I was nervous when I was doing it. I'd get up on stage, I'd just look at the back of the room and just go open gaze and just feel myself calming down. So, and then of course there's respiratory tools, and I'm sure you've talked about many of them. There are some in the book, but breathing in a way that brings down that autonomic arousal. One of the most popular ones that I like to use is called the physiological sigh. Basically, it's this
Yep.
technique where you do a nice deep breath in, a top off, And then a very slow exhale. You do that 5, 6, 7 times. You're blowing out the carbon dioxide. You're bringing yourself down. You're calming yourself. You're bringing that frontal lobe down, back online. So you're literally bringing down, you're buying down anxiety in terms of that equation. Okay. So that's one way we can start to buy down anxiety. Or actually, two ways. We reframe it and we can breathe through it. By reframing it, it's all fiction. It hasn't happened yet. Okay. And then let's bring down our autonomic arousal and bring our frontal lobe back online. And then we can talk about how we buy down uncertainty as well.
Well, let's start with this idea of the fiction. I want to understand that a little bit more.
Yeah.
So I guess the argument would be is, reading the news every single day, 30% of jobs are going away, companies are losing, their focus, shifting business models, the world's transforming. Like this idea that the future story that I have that's creating fear is complete fiction. I want to just understand more because
Yeah.
this stuff that we can do in the moment to deal with that momentary experience of that anxiety and that fear.
Yeah.
But how do we tell ourselves a different story when the stories that we're being told are so pervasive and so difficult and basically a day-to-day onslaught,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and new news stories coming in that all jobs are going away, in the next 5 years.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with this heightened understanding and this fear that maybe we are giving birth to a new species that will take over? Like all of that stuff that more and more um, critical voices coming around and more research and experts are speaking to. So how do we deal with that?
Well, I would say part of it is to do our best to separate fact from fiction. Okay, if you read something in the newspaper that says 30% of jobs are going away, that could be you could say, okay, that's a fact. The fiction part is it's going to happen to me. There's
Mhm.
70% of jobs are staying put. I mean, even if you say all jobs are being lost, well, I still have my job, right? So again, when I was on a SEAL mission, there was always the chance that we could go onto a target and get killed or get shot. I mean, the fact is, when you go into enemy territory or go up against Al Qaeda, they will likely shoot at you to kill. However, I'm not going to be focused on the fact that it's going to happen to me because it hasn't happened to me. That's not what I'm focused on. So the fact is, I will prepare because I will likely get shot at, but I'm not going to worry myself about the fact that I might get shot because that hasn't happened. And so this process of separating fact from fiction is very important because a lot of times as humans we conflate the two and we think what we're reading in fact is in fact happening to us or we project it as happening to us and that's the wrong projection. It's too energetically expensive and it's taking our brain into the wrong focus direction. So I think just the diligence of saying, okay, I recognize this as fact, depending on what I guess newspaper you're reading, but because
Yeah,
even then
yeah.
it might not be fact, right? But I recognize this for what it is, but I'm not going to create a fiction about it. I'm going to ask myself, what do I know? What kind of control in the moment?
So for leaders
Yeah.
who are dealing with employees who have their own version of that story, a more micro story about their own organizations. It might not be that 50% of the jobs are going away, but I work at X company
Mhm.
and my leaders will not tell us we're safe. They won't tell us that we'll have the same jobs. They're leaving all of that a bit vague quite intentionally so
Yeah.
that we don't um I don't know, stay too confident about our jobs or that we don't like anchor and get disappointed when things change. There's a story that leaders have of why they won't affirm and give comfort in this
Yeah.
time. Is that your counselor? How would you modulate that idea of what leaders' role is to deal with this story separation or the fear that's living in their organizations?
Yeah, I would say that in this case, now what we're talking about is uncertainty, and what leaders are doing there, whether they know it or not, is they're generating uncertainty into their people. Their people are feeling uncertain about what's going on. So this is the second part of the equation, is you have uncertainty plus anxiety equals fear. And so what leaders have to recognize is depending on what they choose or choose not to tell people, they are going to be effectively inserting uncertainty or anxiety or both, and therefore generating fear in their people. So we can't, as leaders, we can't be expected to tell everybody everything, and it would be actually disingenuous and probably even more stressful for someone if you just vomited everything you thought in the moment. Okay, so there's always going to be an element of unknown in whatever environment we're in. And so as leaders, we have to recognize to keep that as minimal as possible and recognize the effect that it has on people, so
Mhm.
that they can not generate or encourage this other level of being anxious about that uncertainty. So transparency from a leadership perspective is of utmost importance. As much transparency as can be managed in that moment, recognizing that there's always going to be some level of things we just don't know, so we can't tell. But by the way, if I didn't know something as a leader, a lot of times my strategy was tell them I don't know. Tell the people tell the people who are in my span of care, hey, by the way, this is an unknown and it's unknown to me as well. So let's not worry about that as much right now. And I'd encourage them to not create fictions around it because we just didn't know. Let's focus on what we control. So that's one. In terms of the
Yep.
individual who is experiencing this, this is when we have to look at buying down uncertainty. So, how do we buy down that other factor? We know how to buy down anxiety to a degree. How do we buy down uncertainty? Well, the way we do that is we first have to understand the neurology around what we as human beings do to create certainty in our environment. Our brains are always trying to create certainty by interrogating the environment around us. Three of the primary factors that our brain is trying to interrogate at any given moment are duration, pathway, and outcome. So, in other words, duration, how long is this going to last? Pathway, what's my route, in, out, or through? And then outcome, what's the end state? Now, if we are in absence of one or more of those factors, we begin to feel that stress, that autonomic arousal, all that stuff, and maybe even anxiety. So we'll just give you an example. We'll take an example related to health. Okay, strep throat is an illness that we all know of. We all know that most people nowadays don't die from strep throat because there's an antibiotic you can take when you get strep throat. Okay, so if any of us get strep throat, we are at that moment in absence of only one of the three. So we have our pathway, the antibiotic, and we have the outcome. We're going to get better. What we don't necessarily know is the duration because you may respond to antibiotics a little bit differently than I do. So it might take you one day, it might take me three. So we're in absence of just duration, which means our stress level, our autonomic arousal level is at a mild degree. Now let's take something like the flu. Okay, the flu also a known illness. Most people, at least nowadays, don't die from the flu. However, there's no known cure for the flu. There's nothing you can take. There's a lot of people who have ideas about what you can do, but there's no known thing you can take for the flu.
Mhm.
So if any of us get the flu now, we are in absence of two of the three. Okay, we know the outcome. We're going to get better, but we don't know the pathway and we don't know the duration, which means our autonomic arousal stress level is now at the moderate realm. Now let's imagine a disease shows up and we've never seen it before. Some people are dying from it, other people are not dying from it. There's no vaccine, there's no known cure, and it's spreading across the globe, and we don't know what the end state's going to be. Well, welcome 2020, because this is what we all felt during COVID. We were in absence of all three of them, duration, pathway, outcome. It's why many of us felt so anxious and stressed, and our autonomic arousal was at a heightened state. The way we buy down uncertainty is we take control of our environments and we take control of the duration pathway outcome, but by doing a technique that I talk about in the book called moving horizons. Okay. In other words, we in the moment ask ourselves, what do I know? What kind of control in this moment? You pick something to focus on and you move towards that. And in essence, create your own duration pathway outcome, create your own certainty. So here's an example from Navy SEAL training. So Navy SEAL training, like I said, you spend hundreds of hours running around with these big heavy boats. And I remember it was during Hell Week or something. We'd been running with these boats forever. It was 3 in the morning. We were on the beach. We were all miserable. And next to us was a sand berm. And I remember saying to myself, you know what? I'm just going to focus on getting to the end of this sand berm. What I
Yep.
did in that moment, inadvertently, is I picked a horizon and in essence created a DPO, a duration pathway outcome. Duration from now until end of sandberm, pathway from here to end of sandberm, and then outcome end of sandberm. In doing that, I set for myself I registered a dopamine level that allowed me to embark upon that goal, and then of course I gave myself, or I set up for myself a dopamine reward when I accomplished that goal. That allowed me, once I accomplished it, to come back and ask the question again. Okay, now what do I know and what can I control? And pick another horizon. Now,
Mhm.
this moving horizons process is a cycle that you can just do over and over and over again until basically one of three things happens. Either you accomplish the overall goal, you're done. Two, there's no more uncertainty. You move through the uncertainty, challenge, and stress, whatever that is. Or three, you create enough certainty so that there's no more uncertainty. Because as you move, theoretically, sometimes you're opening that opt of certainty as you go. But you just constantly pick these horizons. And now this horizon picking is very subjective to the individual, both based on the individual themselves and the intensity of the environment. In other words, the more intense the environment, the shorter that horizon might have to be. I remember another thing they do to you in SEAL training is they freeze. You're in the surf zone. They keep you freezing cold, right? And the surf zone out there is in Southern California is really cold. Most people quit SEAL training because of the cold, by the way. So I'm
Mm,
being in the surf zone, freezing, and I'm just saying to myself, you know what? I'm just going to count 5 waves. That was my horizon. Sometimes my
yeah,
horizon was I'm going to make it to the next meal. Sometimes the horizon was I'm going to make it to the next sandburn. What we're doing in those moments is we're manipulating our own dopamine system. Dopamine, we know, is a reward chemical. Yes, it's also more so a motivation chemical. Dopamine is what gets us out of bed in the morning and moving. And when we pick a small goal, this is the neurological equivalent, by the way, of eating the elephant one bite at a time. If we pick something
yeah,
to focus on, we create for ourselves a dopamine level that allows us to embark upon the goal and then get something when we accomplish it. If we pick a horizon that's too far off, we are going to run out of dopamine on the way. Anytime we run out of dopamine, we quit. When we quit anything, it's because we've run out of dopamine. Okay, so if you pick a big too much of a chunk, you're gonna run out of dopamine. If you pick too small of a chunk, you're not going to register the reward, and you'll know that because like, oh, I didn't even feel that, right? So it's a constant game of modulating these horizons. Any one of us can do this in any environment. So if you're in a position at work where suddenly you read some bad news or you get some bad rumors, first of all, separate fact from fiction. Make sure you understand what's fiction, and then you ask yourself, what do I know? What can I control in this moment? Leaders can help us with this process. A leader can say, listen, here's what's happening. I'll give you the facts that I know. Here's what's happening. I'll give
yeah,
you the stuff we don't know. Let's not try to be anxious. Let's focus on what we know and what we can control right now. Let's pick something together and focus on that. This is how we buy down on uncertainty. This is how we buy down anxiety, and therefore fear goes away. And I tell you, Gordon, this is exactly what Navy SEALs do in all environments. This is how we can do what we do without being subject to uh, paralysis through fear or whatever, or anxiety or any of that stuff.
yeah. This was a super important last few minutes. Um, I'm not sure if all leaders feel that their role is to buy these things down, to buy down anxiety and uncertainty, to play whatever role that they can to tell stories that modulate that where possible, like the duration. You only know the duration, if you only know the out, like choose something
Yeah,
to modulate that down rather than nothing, because then you're on your own. It's interesting as I hear you, the name of our company, Agency 150, came out of this idea of agency being a necessary quality, a more
yeah,
important quality today than it's been in the past. Like this sense of having control over your actions and consequences in high degrees of uncertainty is so important. And a lot of what I'm hearing as you describe a DPO sort of mentality or just to choose horizons, it's giving me some semblance of control. Like the world is
yes,
going crazy. There's a lot out of but if I can just make it here, if I could just
yes.
make it there. So these are great. I only have 2 minutes left. So I just want to ask you a closing question. Um, and maybe you're getting at it with this discussion, but if there was only one thing, if
Mhm.
there was one thing that you can offer that for primarily the leaders and managers that are listening to this webinar, when they listen to all of this material and they see the data and they understand their role in it, what's the one step forward that they can take when they get their role in um, accelerating the adaptation, the agility, this transformation that we're under? What's the one first step, first horizon that you would counsel?
I would say practice horizon shifting. Okay. And the good news about this is it doesn't have to be in an uncertain environment to be able to practice this. You can, in fact, most of us humans have done this in different capacities. We almost all of us do it in the gym, by the way. And the gym is not an uncertain environment, right? We say, I'm not going to focus on the entire workout. I'm going to focus on this one set. We can do it at work. I'm not going to focus on all this stuff that's going on. I'm going to pick something to prioritize, focus on that, and start practicing this horizon shifting. You can do this anywhere, and what that'll do is that'll exercise that muscle so that when uncertainty in fact does hit, then you can in fact you find yourself doing it without thinking. The masters of uncertainty, we do this without thinking. We just immediately chunk our environments and start focusing on one thing at a time over and over again. So I would say first thing, if only thing, practice horizon shifting because at a minimum, and oh, by the way, a horizon, your first horizon could be combined with bringing down your stress. It could be I'm going to focus on taking 5 breaths. That's my first
Mhm.
horizon. You do that, all right? Now where I sit. Okay, well, I'm going to take 10 more breaths. Okay, now where I sit. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do this. Just start stepping through, stepping through. Again, I could outline, we don't have the time. I could outline some of the most complex missions that you could ever think of in Afghanistan or Iraq that we went on. I mean, with hundreds of different things we had to do over hours and hours and hours. Never once did any of us ever focus on what the next step was. Hey, what do I have to focus on right this moment? Do that. Do that correctly, do that, and then do the next thing. Now do the next thing. This is what I would encourage people to practice.
Excellent. And if our audience, could learn more from your book, how do they get your book?
It's definitely on Amazon. Masters of Uncertainty is on Amazon and Attributes as well. You could go to our website, theattributes.com, and you can find it all there as well. So, and then yeah, check us out. But yeah, all where all books are sold.
Thank you, sir. And if you want to hear this podcast or the other ones, the other webinars, I'm sorry, go to agency150.com on YouTube. Or if you want to download the report, agency.com, agency150.com. And we hope that you continue to learn together with us. So thank you for being on our journey. Thank you so much, Rich, for joining today.
Thanks, Gordon.
See you guys. Thanks so much. Cheers.